Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 14. Back at the police station, Alan explained to his sergeant why Agnes had been so upset. I do think she has a point. While she was telling me all this, I kept thinking back to Alice Thurgood. I can't say I noticed any resemblance between her and Agnes at the time, but on reflection, she could be right. Alan took out his phone and looked at the photo again. I want copies of this picture printed out and given to every police officer working this case. They need to be aware that this man is a suspect. However, be sure they understand. They mustn't do anything to alert him to the fact we are onto him. We need positive proof he is involved before we bring him in. In the meantime, we need to keep a close eye on him. He paused. I want to know his every move. Andrews transferred the photo to his computer and began printing off some copies. Why don't we just go to the hotel and question him? For goodness sake, Sergeant, at the moment we have absolutely nothing on him. Even the photograph is nothing without something to back it up. For the time being, we'll continue to let him believe he has got away with whatever it is he has done and hope he does something to trip an alarm. Andrews pulled the photos from the printer. I'll get these spread around the office. Alan nodded. And remember, we keep a low profile, watch and listen. Make sure everyone understands that. Hopefully we'll get something more solid to go on. When Andrews disappeared down the corridor, Alan sat back in his chair. If only Agnes wasn't caught up in all this. On one side of the coin, he was pleased. She had refused to leave the hotel. It would have been disappointing if she had packed up and left. But on the other side, he was very concerned about her safety. If Drummond had been involved in the murder, it meant he was an extremely dangerous man, more especially if he thought Agnes had evidence, which might incriminate him. Was there something they could do to make Drummond realize he was watching the wrong woman? What if Agnes was to leave her phone lying around when Drummond was nearby? Maybe if he picked it up and looked at the stored photographs and found nothing to incriminate him, he would leave her alone. Alan looked down at the floor and shook his head. Surely he could come up with something not so damn obvious. Yet, despite giving it more thought, nothing else came to mind. Perhaps they could talk about it over dinner that evening. The thought of dinner reminded him he needed to book a table somewhere. He pondered for a moment over where to take Agnes this evening. There were still a couple of rather nice restaurants on the quayside, which he might enjoy. But would she rather go up into the city? He should have insisted she made the decision this time. Yet he had the feeling she would still have left it to him. He would like to have had time to linger on those thoughts for a while longer, but someone popped their head around the door informing him the superintendent would like to see him right away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Agnes sat quietly in her room after Alan had left. She had been surprised when she saw David Drummond's picture on Alice's phone. She certainly hadn't expected to see anyone she would recognize. It had left her quite shaken when she realized why he might be tailing her. Even now, she felt uncomfortable, knowing he was actually staying in this very hotel. At the moment, he didn't know which room she was in or even what floor she was on, thanks to the lift attendant. But he could find out easily enough. All he had to do was to point her out to one of the receptionists and they could fill him in on all her details. There was the option of moving to another hotel, but it was possible Drummond would find her. He could telephone various hotels in the city and ask whether she was staying there, giving some excuse for needing to contact her urgently. To avoid that, she would need to check in under a different name. Alan hadn't answered her question before he left. When she had asked him, "What's next?" he simply told her he was heading back to the station. "I want some copies of this photo printed out." That wasn't what she had meant at all, though she guessed he knew that already. He probably didn't want her to get any further involved. She sighed. Yet, for goodness sake, she was already involved and she wanted to continue to help find out what was going on at the hotel. She ticked off the events on her fingers. First, there were robberies. Then a woman, who happened to be staying at the hotel, was murdered, though her body was not found here. Third, today they find that another guest could possibly be involved in one or even both of the crimes. So what would be next? She sighed. This was as close as she had ever come to investigating a real crime, and she wasn't going to be put off by the detective working the case, even if he was trying to keep her out of harm's way. But where did she go from here? What would be number 4 on the list? Agnes took a deep breath. She needed to start at the beginning, when the first robbery took place. But what if that hadn't been the first theft? Something could have happened before she arrived. Perhaps, back then, whatever went missing hadn't been noticed until the people left the hotel. She shook her head. No, there was no way she could go down that road. She could only dwell on what had happened since she arrived at the hotel a few days ago. Gosh, was it only a few days ago? So much had happened, it seemed as though she had been here for a couple of weeks. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Alan knocked on the superintendent's door and walked in. You wanted to see me, sir? Yes, sit down. The superintendent gestured towards a chair on the other side of his desk. How can I help you? Alan asked once he was seated. It's about these robberies at the hotel. I have had the chief constable on the phone asking me what is being done and couldn't tell him a damn thing. The superintendent sat back in his chair. Are you any further forward with the investigation? There's been a murder since I first started to investigate the robbery. A woman staying at the hotel was found dead outside the Bessie Surtees Museum a couple of nights ago. I thought that would take priority. Alan noticed the superintendent fidget in his chair. Yes, of course, the superintendent replied. He coughed. I think the chief constable wants to be kept in the loop and looks to me for answers. We think the murder and the robberies could be connected, Alan suggested. He hoped he wasn't going to be asked to explain why he had come to that conclusion, because at that moment he had no real evidence. I see. The superintendent paused for a moment before leaning forward. Yes, I see how there could be a connection. This poor woman might have seen something and had to be silenced before she reported it. Very good, Johnson. I'll pass that on to the chief constable. Very little else was said before Alan was dismissed. He heaved a sigh of relief as he stepped out into the corridor. He had come out of that unscathed. It had surprised him that the chief constable could put a robbery before a murder, but he supposed with Mrs. Hargreaves on his back he would have to look for something to appease her. Back in the office, Andrews was on the phone. He looked up as Alan entered and placed his hand over the mouthpiece. There's been another robbery at the hotel, sir. Not another one, Alan murmured as he slumped into his chair to wait until Andrews had finished the call. A diamond necklace and a pair of diamante earrings have gone missing this time, said the sergeant, reading from his notes. It seems the couple had only been out of the hotel for 2 hours. They were meeting some friends in the Sage. When they got back, the wife went to put her jewelry in a box by the bed and she found some pieces were missing. Before calling the manager, they both searched all the drawers to make sure she hadn't put them somewhere else by mistake, but they weren't there. This is ridiculous. Alan thumped his fist on his desk. This whole case was beginning to irritate him. How is the thief gaining access to the rooms without a key card? Now he was talking more to himself than to Andrews. The manager tells us that only trusted staff is allowed to use these cards for cleaning, etc. At all other times the key cards are locked away. Yet somehow, someone is able to get hold of one of these cards, get into the rooms and steal expensive jewelry. He looked across at Andrews. Despite what the manager says, this has got to be an inside job. One of the staff must know something. Hopefully, when we find out who it is, we will find our killer. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 15. Agnes felt the need to get out of her room. Alan had suggested she should stay inside the hotel until he picked her up that evening, but she was beginning to feel trapped. Peering out of the window, she saw there were several people milling around on the quayside below. Surely, with so many people about, it would be safe for her to venture out. Even a walk around the outside of the hotel would be better than being a virtual prisoner in her room. She was enjoying a glass of wine at one of the tables outside a cafe close to the Millennium Bridge when something above caught her eye. Looking up, she smiled when she saw a bird flying above the cafe. It was most likely looking for food dropped by people having lunch outside. But as she was about to turn away, she noticed someone leaning out of one of the hotel windows. Another person, enjoying the scenery, she thought. However, she suddenly realized the person wasn't admiring the view of the Tyne. They were looking down at the pavement beneath the window. From her position, Agnes wasn't able to see who or what the person was looking at. The cafe building blocked out the lower part of the hotel. At first, she was tempted to slide off her chair and move to the side of the cafe to see what this person was looking at. But she noticed the tables outside the cafe were filling up rather quickly. The chances were her wine would be whisked away by a passing waiter and she would lose her seat. With that discouraging thought in mind, she decided to stay where she was. A few minutes later, her attention had turned to the people streaming towards the Millennium Bridge. Some were wearing casual clothes, obviously tourists, but there were people dressed as though they were going to business meetings. From her brief visit to the Baltic, she had picked up the fact there were rooms available for such meetings. She picked up her glass and took a sip of wine, but almost choked when she unexpectedly saw a face she recognized. Setting her glass down on the table, she looked again to make sure. Nevertheless, she had been right the first time. It was David Drummond. Her eyes followed him as he approached the bridge. At first, he seemed focused on wherever he was going. However, as he was about to step onto the bridge, he stopped abruptly and looked towards where she was sitting. It was almost as though he knew someone was watching him. She swiftly turned her head in the direction of the cafe, hoping he hadn't seen her observing him. However, as it turned out, she could see his reflection in the cafe windows. He stood there for a moment, as though he was considering whether he should come across to speak with her. But when the people gathering behind him urged him to move on, he swiftly continued across the bridge. Agnes breathed a sigh of relief, yet she wondered whether it might have been better if he had actually confronted her with whatever was bothering him. If it was the wretched photograph he was concerned about, then she could have honestly told him she had no such picture on her phone. She could even have shown him her phone as proof. He was halfway across the bridge before she dared to turn to look back at him. She picked him out easily, but then, quite suddenly, he disappeared into a crowd of people. Her eyes flashed from one person to another as numerous people crossed the bridge, but she didn't see Drummond again. Part of her wanted to rush across the bridge to see whether she could pick up his trail. He might have gone to the yacht, which was still moored on the other side of the Tyne. If he was meeting up with someone from the yacht, it was possible she could take a photograph of them talking together. The police might be very interested to see it, but then her cautious side took over. If she was right, and Drummond believed she had photographed him that night, she would only be adding fuel to the fire if he caught her spying on him. Therefore, after further thought, she decided to play it safe and stay where she was. Nevertheless, she couldn't help wondering whether it was Jim, her late husband, or her friend, Chief Inspector Alan Johnson. She could hear shouting in her ear to play it safe and leave it alone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. David Drummond continued to walk across the bridge. He wanted to turn around to see if the woman was watching him, but he forced himself to keep going. There was no point in making himself even more conspicuous. Besides, there was no need. He could feel her eyes following his every step. That wretched woman seemed to be everywhere he went. As he drew nearer to the end of the bridge, he quickened his pace slightly and mingled with a group of people in front of him. He had seen them leaving a coach parked on the other side of the river. From their raised voices, he learned that some of them were visiting Tyneside for the first time. The tour guide was explaining all the changes which had taken place in recent years. If he left the bridge safely tucked in with them, he might have a chance of slipping off to meet his partners without being seen by the busybody on the other side. Everything had been going according to plan until Mary had overheard him on the phone one evening. How could he have been so careless? Why hadn't he waited until he was safely in his room before making the call? Instead, he had used his mobile outside the hotel. Mary had been around the corner smoking a cigarette. Even now, he could kick himself. That one stupid mistake had cost the woman her life. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Agnes heard a tap on her door close to 7 o'clock. Who is it? She called out cautiously. She had made the decision to be extra careful if anyone knocked on her door, especially if she hadn't ordered room service. Recognizing Alan's voice, she opened the door. I'm pleased to see you have taken my advice about being wary who you open the door to, Alan said, as he walked into the room. Yes, and you are going to be proud of me when I tell you my latest piece of news. Alan raised his eyebrows, inviting her to continue. But Agnes wasn't prepared to say another word until they were seated in the restaurant and able to exchange information. Never be rushed, Jim had always said. Give a little, take a little. There was no way she was going to allow that to change, no matter who she was dealing with. You first, Agnes said, once they were seated in the restaurant. Actually, Alan looked down at his clenched hands. I don't have any further information. And on top of that, the superintendent called me into his office wanting to know why we haven't found who is stealing the jewelry at the hotel. Oh, Alan, I am so sorry. Agnes leaned forward across the table. Surely he must realize a murder must come before some stupid theft. Yes, I'm sure he does. Alan sighed, but at the same time, he has the chief constable on his back because Mrs. Hargreaves has called in a favor. It seems she knows him personally and has put it to him to find the culprit and get her jeweler back. Of course, it starts with him, but then it gets passed down the chain until it reaches the likes of me. Then I'm supposed to drop everything until people like Mrs. Hargreaves are satisfied. He shrugged. So what have you got to tell me? He paused. I thought you weren't going out anywhere until I called for you. For goodness sake, Alan, I'm here on holiday. I am trying to trace my past life. I can't do it by sitting in my room all day. If I have to do that, then I might well, forget the whole thing and go back home. Alan nodded. What she said was true, but he would be very sad to see her leave. The evenings he had spent with her over the last few days had been a far cry from the weeks and months he had spent alone. Occasionally he would invite someone out for a meal, but no one had met up to his expectations, not like Agnes. Agnes was different. There was something about her which excited him. She was a woman with a mind of her own. She did what she wanted to do and thought about it after the event. When he had been in the army, he'd been much the same. He'd enjoyed not knowing what was ahead. Back then, every day had been an adventure. Yes, the sergeant or sergeant major had chirped in with what they'd thought he should be doing or how they believed he should be doing it. Yet, in the end, they had accepted his decision and stood by him. But here in the police force, even if you were a fair way up the scale of promotion, you had to adhere to whatever the top brass said. Okay, Agnes felt sorry for Alan, even without him saying anything. Further, she'd picked up on his problem. Let me tell you about my day. She began at the beginning, telling how she had seen someone leaning out of one of the windows of the hotel. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone admiring the view. I have to say, the view from the windows of the hotel are really... Okay, I get it, Alan interrupted. He threw his hands in the air. The view is good, so what? If you're in that sort of mood, then I'm going back to the hotel. Agnes picked up her handbag as though she was about to leave. Alan reached across the table and grabbed her hand. Agnes, I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean to upset you. I guess I'm frustrated at how this case is going. Please tell me about the face at the window. Agnes placed her bag back on the floor. She could understand his frustration. His case seemed to be going backwards. Nevertheless, that was no reason to take it out on her. Very well, she said after a long pause. Like I said, I have seen people leaning out the windows of the hotel several times. I thought they were trying to get a better view of the bridges along the River Tyne. She shrugged. Perhaps they were. But giving it some thought, I realized that all the windows looking towards the Tyne have a slight bay. It's possible to see up and down the river without actually leaning out and maybe falling down to the pavement below. While she was talking, Agnes was gesturing with her hands, demonstrating how easily anyone could fall from the window. I see, said Alan. Well, no, I don't really. Yes, I agree that someone could lose their balance and fall if they were too enthusiastic about how far they could see. But I'm not sure where you're leading with this. I'm coming to that, said Agnes excitedly. Today, when I was sitting outside the cafe, I saw someone hanging out of the window again. I couldn't see who it was, but the person wasn't looking up and down the river. They were staring straight down at the pavement beneath the window. So? Alan questioned. He still couldn't see why she was making such a big deal of someone looking out of the window. Surely people did it all the time when they stayed at a hotel. Well, while I was sitting there, I got to thinking, what if he wasn't simply admiring the view? What if there was another reason why he or she was hanging out of the window? What if it was all prearranged? What if he or she was at the open window for some ulterior motive? Hang on a minute. There are a lot of ifs there. What ulterior motive? Alan frowned. I really do think you have read too many Miss Marple books. What? Could anyone be doing wrong simply by leaning out of the window? He looked up as the waiter handed them each a menu. He nodded and ordered a bottle of wine before looking back at Agnes. Agnes held up her menu and peered inside, but then she lowered it and looked across at Alan. What if? Please, Agnes, Alan interrupted. No more what ifs. Agnes smiled. What if She continued, ignoring his comment. Whoever is stealing the jewelry is getting it out of the hotel by dropping it from the open window into the hands of an accomplice. An accomplice who just happens to be waiting on the pavement below. She slowly raised the menu to her eyes again and began to look through the tempting meals on offer. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Alan stared across the table as he thought over what Agnes had just said. Was it possible she could be right? Back at the police station, the big question had been, how had the thief managed to smuggle the jewelry out of the hotel? No one had been allowed to leave the hotel until their luggage and their rooms had been searched. Of course, there were occasions when the theft hadn't been noticed until later in the day. Then the thief could have walked out with it in his pocket. On the other hand, how did the thief know when the victims would return to the hotel? They could have simply popped out for a few minutes and returned to find their jewelry missing. In that event, they would have called the manager and the police without further ado. Anyone wanting to leave the hotel would have been stopped until there had been a full search. The waiter returned with the wine and poured them each a glass. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What do you think? Agnes asked. She took a sip of her wine. I think you could be onto something, Alan replied. No, silly, Agnes left. I meant, what were you going to have from the menu? I haven't even looked. I've been too busy thinking about what you said. Well, I have something else for you to think about. Agnes closed the menu and leaned across the table. When I saw the person leaning out of the window this afternoon, I was tempted to creep up to the corner of the cafe to see whether there was anyone waiting below. But I didn't. I stayed where I was because I didn't want to lose my table. Anyway, it was only a few minutes afterwards that I saw David Drummond appear in my line of sight. He was heading towards the Millennium Bridge. He caught me watching him, so I looked away until he was halfway over the bridge. When I looked back, I caught a brief glimpse of him before I lost him in the crowd. She paused, but it set me thinking. What if? She held up her hand as Alan was about to interrupt. Please, Alan, hear me out. What if he had been standing on the pavement beneath the window waiting to catch the stolen jewelry when it was dropped to the ground? Alan thought about what she had said. It was feasible. Nevertheless, it was a long shot. There were people wandering past the hotel all the time. Wouldn't someone have noticed and thought it strange that something was being thrown down to a man waiting below? I know what you were thinking, Agnes interrupted his thoughts. The quayside is busy. People walking past would have seen it happening. But what if these two individuals have some sort of an arrangement? What arrangement? I don't know. Agnes flapped her hands in frustration. I can't think of everything. She paused. Wait, I have an idea. What if the guy upstairs rings the guy on the ground to tell him he's ready to drop the loot? Anyone nearby might think the guy on the ground has left something in his room and can't be bothered to go all the way back up to get it and is asking his pal to drop it down for him, especially if he is standing with his phone to his ear. Does that work for you? Before Alan could say anything, the waiter appeared to take their order. With so much talking going on, neither had really taken a lot of notice of what was on offer. They both looked at the menu and ordered the first thing they saw before getting back to the conversation. It's possible, Alan said slowly, once the waiter had disappeared. But don't you think it is too easy? That's what makes it so probable, Agnes replied. Why make something long-winded and complicated when there is a perfectly simple way to smuggle stolen goods out of the hotel? Jewelry is very light, so it wouldn't be a problem for someone to catch it. Alan still wasn't sure he agreed. However, he was prepared to give it more thought. Meanwhile, he changed tack. There is still the question of how someone is getting into the rooms to steal the items. Agnes shook her head. I've thought about that, too, but I haven't come up with an answer. Unless someone has managed to invent a master keycard, it looks like one of the staff is involved. She paused, but I don't like to think one of them is a thief. They are also polite and helpful to the guests. Let's change the subject. Alan nodded towards the waiter as he approached them. He was carrying their meals. Let's not, Agnes replied. We haven't mentioned the murder of Mary Swinburne yet. Have you had any results from your lab? Do you think it's possible that the murder and the thefts are connected? Could she have been involved? Or might she have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Whoa, slow down. Alan held up his hands as though shielding himself from the barrage of questions. At this precise moment, we are no further forward Hopefully we will hear from the lab tomorrow. But if the blood on the pavement doesn't turn out to be from Mary Swinburne, then it could mean we have a second murder on our hands." He thought for a moment. Unless there was some sort of an accident there, in which case we would need to check the hospitals to find out whether anyone had been admitted over the last couple of days. He looked at Agnes and sighed. Now, can we simply enjoy our meal without all this talk of murder and theft? Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 16. The sun was shining brightly through the window when Agnes awoke the next morning. How lucky she had been with the weather so far. It could be rather cold and damp in October. However, it seemed summer was reluctant to step back and make way for autumn this year. She lay for a few minutes, reflecting on the evening before. Alan had insisted on escorting her up to her room. It had been rather late when they got back to the hotel, and he had suggested that the lift attendant might have gone off duty. She hadn't argued with him. There was no way that she wanted to be alone in the lift with David Drummond. As it turned out, the lift attendant had still been on duty and there was no sign of Drummond. But it was better to be safe than sorry. She wondered whether she should mention any of this to her sons in Australia. She felt a little guilty at keeping them in the dark. They knew she was spending a week or two on Tyneside, but though she had given them each a call on the day she arrived, she hadn't got back to them since. Best to keep it to myself, she thought, as she dragged herself from beneath the duvet. They would only worry and no doubt tell her to go back home. Not that she would do as she was told, but if she resisted, there was the possibility one of them might make the long trip to England to talk her into it. Pulling back the curtains, she looked down onto the quayside. The view was rather striking from up here. It was then she noticed a small chain at the top of the window that opened. The other end of it was fixed to a stationary window, probably to stop the window opening too far. If that was the case, how was the person able to open the window far enough to lean out and drop the booty? Moving closer, she reached up and took hold of the chain. She moved it around a little, but it held firm. She sniffed. There had to be a way of releasing it. She took a step back and looked at it for a few moments. Then she realized one of the links was slightly larger than the others. It was where it was fastened to, the stationary window. She took hold of the chain again and found that with a little maneuvering, the link could be slid over the bolt holding it in place. Satisfied that she had solved the puzzle, Agnes set about getting dressed. Over breakfast, she deliberated over what to do that day. Should she hang around the hotel in the hope of finding out who was behind the robberies and how the thief was getting into the rooms? But, on reflection, how would she do that? She couldn't wander around the corridors all day expecting to find someone fiddling with a lock. That would only draw attention to herself. She might even be suspected of being the thief. Neither would she learn anything by sitting in the drawing room watching people as they come and go about their business. Besides, that would be terribly boring. In the end, she decided to go for a stroll along the quay to Bessie Surtees' house, to the spot where she and Alan had found the body a few nights ago. She wasn't really expecting to find any new clues. The police, forensics, and goodness knows who else had been over the area with a fine-tooth comb on the evening of the murder and the morning after. Nevertheless, the walk would do her good and she might even go inside the house if the police had allowed it to reopen. Alan's morning hadn't gone well. The blood found on the pavement was not that of Mary Swinburne. So we are back to square one. Alan thumped his fist on his desk. So what the hell was David Drummond doing skirting around Granger Street the other evening? And if it wasn't Mary Swinburne's blood, whose was it? Sir, do you think we need to start this investigation from the beginning? Sergeant Andrews spoke quietly. The sergeant was aware that going back and starting from the beginning of a case was something DCI Johnson hated. He was a man who liked to get things right from the outset. Yet that wasn't always possible. There were times when the clues all led to a dead end and there was nothing else for it but to begin again. It was annoying, but it was something that went with the job. And where would that be? Alan retorted. Do we go back to the thefts as the chief constable would have us do? Or do we start with the murder of Mary Swinburne? Or even begin by investigating the KG David Drummond? Alan shook his head. He hadn't meant to jump down his sergeant's throat. It wasn't his fault the investigation was falling apart. Yet at the moment, Alan knew his concentration wasn't entirely on the case. For one thing, he couldn't get Agnes out of his mind. He wasn't looking forward to the day she would return to her life in Essex, but at the same time, he was very concerned for her safety. Already, Mary Swinburne, who had been a guest at the hotel, was lying dead in the mortuary at this very moment, and no one knew why. Was it possible she had seen or overheard something incriminating and was murdered to keep her from passing on information to the police? If that was the case, then Agnes could be next. She was poking around everywhere, trying to find more and more evidence. Even now, she could be out there keeping watch on David Drummond. That last thought filled Alan with utmost horror. He had to get to the hotel too, make sure she was all right, get on to the pathologist and ask him to take another look at the body. There might be something he's missed. Alan barked out instructions as he reached for his coat. After that, start trying to find out a little more about David Drummond. For goodness sake, someone must know who the hell he is. Okay, sir. Andrews reached for his phone. Where will you be? I'm going back to the hotel to do a little more probing around. I suddenly get the feeling that there is more going on there than jewel thefts. Such as? Andrews asked. I don't know, the DCI replied, impatiently. It was true, he didn't know. But thinking about Mary Swinburne, the thefts, and now the possibility of another murder in the city center all being linked, made him wonder why Drummond hadn't simply disappeared when he believed Agnes was watching him. There had to be something else, some greater reason, for him to hang around the hotel. But at the moment, his main concern was for Agnes. Keep me informed with anything you find. And check the hospitals again. We need to be absolutely sure someone wasn't picked up on Granger Street and dumped outside an accident and emergency department in the city. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Agnes was enjoying her walk along the quayside. She was going to miss this. When she went back to Essex, she lived in a quiet village, and though it was very pleasant, she missed having more people around her. True, she had lots of friends in the village, but being here was different. Even though she didn't know the people she passed on the street, they all nodded and smiled as though she met up with them every morning. This was one part of Tyneside she remembered. Well, the friendliness of the people. It wasn't long before she found herself opposite Bessie Surtees' house. She looked up at the window she had seen being pulled shut that fateful night. There was someone gazing out of the window. Obviously, the house was open to visitors again. She crossed the road and stood on the very spot where she and Alan had found the body. There was nothing to see. It was as though she had dreamed the whole thing. She wasn't sure what she had expected to find. Alan had told her that no blood had been found either on the pavement or in the house itself, nor had the police discovered who had been in the house at the time they found the body. Why had Mary Swinburne been murdered? What had the poor woman done to upset someone enough for them to kill her? Why had her body been dumped here? Agnes looked towards the River Tyne. Could they have meant to throw the body into the river? If so, why had they found it necessary to stop and dump it on the pavement? And did David Drummond have anything to do with any of this? All these questions and more ran through her mind as she stood there gazing down at the ground. You all right, pet? Agnes looked up to see an elderly woman staring at her. Yes, thank you. It's just you looked a little lost standing there. I thought you might not be feeling well. I'm fine, thank you. Agnes smiled at the woman. The woman nodded and was about to turn away when Agnes quickly caught her arm. It's just that a friend and I found a body here a few nights ago, and I understand the police still don't know why the poor woman was killed. Agnes let go of the woman's arm. She was surprised at herself. Why on earth had she said that? Yes, that was a shame. Poor woman, I read about it in the papers. Nasty. Shock for you and your friend, though, coming across a body like that. Yes it was. Agnes nodded. There are some terrible people in the world. I'm sorry to have troubled you. Thank you for your concern. The woman started to walk off, but then changed her mind and turned back to face Agnes. I did see her one day. The woman nodded down towards the pavement. Her? The lady who got herself killed. I saw her one day here on the quayside. I recognized her when I saw her photo in the papers. It wasn't a good photo, you understand, 'cause she was lying dead in the mortuary when the picture was taken. But it was the same woman. When did you see her? Agnes asked excitedly. It was a few days before she was found dead. I told my elf that I'd seen the murdered woman here on the quayside, but he said I was off my rocker. Yet I know what I saw. Was she with anyone? Agnes prompted. Yes, she was with a man. The woman stared ahead of her as she tried to remember what she'd seen. They were talking, but I couldn't hear what was being said. I do remember the men seemed to be trying to get her to go with him. At one point, he grabbed her arm, but she was having none of it. She just pulled away and left him standing there on his own. She ran away? No. She just walked off looking a bit huffed, exactly like I do with my elf when we've had words. Did you tell the police about what you had seen? Agnes asked. No, my elf said it was best to stay out of it. She shrugged. He said I'd probably got it all wrong anyway. One more thing, Agnes said, pulling her phone out of her handbag. Was this the man you saw talking with the murdered woman? She showed her the video she had taken of David Drummond on the quayside a few days ago. Yes, that's him. The woman looked up sharply. Here, you're not a copper, are you? No, I'm not the police, said Agnes. The woman looked relieved. I'll be on my way, then. Nice talking to you. She hurried off before Agnes could say another word. Agnes stood outside Bessie Surtees' house for a few minutes, pondering on what the woman had told her. It appeared that Mary Swinburne had been talking to David Drummond shortly before she was murdered. What had they been discussing? The woman didn't seem to think that Mary had run away from him. It was more like she had disagreed with him about something and had stalked off. So, now the big question was, what was that something? Had it been enough to get her murdered? The woman had now disappeared from sight. Agnes was annoyed that, during the conversation, she hadn't asked for her name. But it was too late now. Agnes was just about to walk towards the entrance of the house when she got a feeling someone was watching her. She decided against turning around to take a look. Instead, she continued on her way to the house. Nevertheless, her eyes were fixed on the large windows in front of her. With a bit of luck, the reflection would show whether she was right and there was someone staring at her, or would it prove that she really was becoming paranoid? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Alan Johnson arrived at the hotel shortly after Agnes left. The receptionist told him she had seen her leave a few minutes ago. Did she say where she was going? Alan asked. No, I'm sorry, she didn't. Alan was about to ask whether the manager was available when he suddenly appeared from his office. He looked rather flustered and seemed relieved to see the chief inspector standing in the reception area. Chief Inspector Johnson, Mr. Jenkins said as he hurried towards him. There has been another robbery. I was just on my way upstairs. Perhaps you could join me. What was taken this time? More jewelry. Alan answered his own question before the manager had time to speak. Yes, Jenkins replied, leading the way over to the lift. This is now much more than a joke. My job and the reputation of this hotel are on the line. Don't you have any idea who might be doing this? I'm afraid not, but we are keen to catch the thief and, of course, the murderer. Please don't mention Mary Swinburne's murder when we are in Mr. and Mrs. Anderson's room. Mr. Jenkins flapped his hands vigorously. Having a thief in the hotel is bad enough. I don't want them to think we have a murderer staying here, too. Alan nodded. He could understand the manager's problem. A great deal of money had been spent on making this hotel one of the grandest in the area. Its prime position here on the quayside had, until now, drawn guests from far and wide. However, once word was out that the hotel had a resident thief, not to mention a murderer, visitors to the area would very soon choose somewhere else to stay. By now, the two men had reached the lift. The attendant stood aside, allowing them to step inside. But Alan's last thought caused him to stop in his tracks. Could that be it? Could that be the purpose of everything which had happened over the last week? Could there be someone out there who wanted this hotel threatened with closure? Are you coming, Chief Inspector? The sound of the manager's voice hauled Alan back to the present. Yes, he said, quickly stepping into the lift. Sorry, I suddenly thought of something that might be relevant. The lift doors closed, and before long Alan and Mr. Jenkins had arrived at the appointed floor. The manager hadn't said anything while they were in the lift, but once they were alone in the corridor, Mr. Jenkins wanted to know what the chief inspector thought might be pertinent to the case. I can't say anything at the moment, Alan replied. I need to check a few things out, but I will definitely get back to you. Alan could see that Jenkins wasn't happy about being left in the dark, but he wasn't sure about anything himself at the moment, so how could he tell him things he didn't know? I promise I'll get back to you as soon as I have a clearer picture in my mind. Meanwhile, let's go and see the Andersons." The manager heaved a sigh. The determined look on the inspector's face told him he wasn't going to get anything further and that he should leave it alone. Without another word, he turned and led the way to the room where the Andersons were waiting. They were told that the stolen necklace was an heirloom. Mrs. Anderson, a woman in her late 40s, looked so distraught she could hardly speak. She gestured to her husband to do the talking. Mr. Anderson was about 50 years old. He was going bald. However, he had a rather heavy mustache, almost as though it was to make up for the loss of hair. "We haven't had a single problem of theft, robbery, whatever you want to call it, until we came here. That necklace is worth a fortune," he raged. "If we don't get it back, we will sue this hotel." "I'm not sure that's possible," said the manager. "You see, we have a safe where all guests are advised to deposit any jewelry, charge cards, anything the guest thinks valuable. If you choose to ignore our advice, then the responsibility is totally left with you." Alan could tell Mr. Anderson was not impressed. "Don't think for 1 minute that will let you off the hook." Anderson moved closer to the manager and stared at him in a threatening manner. "I have spoken with my solicitor. He agrees that there is room for doubt about a hotel safe being really safe. Besides, if someone can get into our room without having a key card, how secure is your damn safe?" Mr. Jenkins swallowed hard and pointed towards Alan. "This is Chief Inspector Johnson from CID. He has assured me they will do their utmost to find the culprit and recover your wife's jewelry." "Is that so?" Mr. Anderson turned his attention to Alan. "Well, I do hope so, because when my solicitor has finished with this hotel, he will turn his attention to the Newcastle police force. Make no mistake about that." Alan was not about to put up with any intimidations from this man. While he understood Mr. Anderson being annoyed over the loss of an expensive piece of jewelry, he was not about to be blackmailed, nor was he going to allow this man to intimidate the manager of the hotel. For goodness sake, guests had to take some responsibility for their possessions, most especially if they were as expensive as they were proclaiming. "Mr. Anderson, you are doing absolutely nothing to help your situation by accusing the hotel manager or the police of responsibility for the stolen jewelry. Then who is to blame?" Mr. Anderson fumed. Alan hesitated for a moment before replying. "It could be you, either of you. You both say you brought an heirloom to this hotel, something of immense value. Yet neither of you registered this very expensive piece of jewelry at reception. You didn't even ask to deposit it into the hotel safe, which I know to be very secure." He paused. "How can we be expected to believe such an item exists? And if it does, how do we know that you even brought it to the hotel? Yet you expect the hotel and the police to jump through hoops to find it, though no one here has actually set eyes on it. How do you speak to us like that?" Mr. Anderson spluttered. He glanced at his wife and then back at the chief inspector. "Your superior will hear about this." "Yes, I'm sure he will," Alan replied calmly. He was beginning to tire of this man's threats. "If not from you, then he will hear it from me." He paused to allow the mood in the room to cool down. "Now, Mr. Anderson, shall we start again?" Murder on Tyneside. The sun was shining brightly through the window when Agnes awoke the next morning. How lucky she had been with the weather so far. It could be rather cold and damp in October. However, it seemed summer was reluctant to step back and make way for autumn this year. She lay for a few minutes, reflecting on the evening before. Alan had insisted on escorting her up to her room. It had been rather late when they got back to the hotel, and he had suggested that the lift attendant might have gone off duty. She hadn't argued with him. There was no way that she wanted to be alone in the lift with David Drummond. As it turned out, the lift attendant had still been on duty and there was no sign of Drummond. But it was better to be safe than sorry. She wondered whether she should mention any of this to her sons in Australia. She felt a little guilty at keeping them in the dark. They knew she was spending a week or two on Tyneside. But though she had given them each a call on the day she arrived, she hadn't got back to them since. Best to keep it to myself, she thought, as she dragged herself from beneath the duvet. They would only worry and no doubt tell her to go back home. Not that she would do as she was told, but if she resisted, there was the possibility one of them might make the long trip to England to talk her into it. Pulling back the curtains, she looked down onto the quayside. The view was rather striking from up here. It was then she noticed a small chain at the top of the window that opened. The other end of it was fixed to a stationary window, probably to stop the window opening too far. If that was the case, how was the person able to open the window far enough to lean out and drop the booty? Moving closer, she reached up and took hold of the chain. She moved it around a little, but it held firm. She sniffed. There had to be a way of releasing it. She took a step back and looked at it for a few moments. Then she realized one of the links was slightly larger than the others. It was where it was fastened to, the stationary window. She took hold of the chain again and found that with a little maneuvering, the link could be slid over the bolt holding it in place. Satisfied that she had solved the puzzle, Agnes set about getting dressed. Over breakfast, she deliberated over what to do that day. Should she hang around the hotel in the hope of finding out who was behind the robberies and how the thief was getting into the rooms? But, on reflection, how would she do that? She couldn't wander around the corridors all day expecting to find someone fiddling with a lock. That would only draw attention to herself. She might even be suspected of being the thief. Neither would she learn anything by sitting in the drawing room watching people as they come and go about their business. Besides, that would be terribly boring. In the end, she decided to go for a stroll along the quay to Bessie Surtees' house, to the spot where she and Alan had found the body a few nights ago. She wasn't really expecting to find any new clues. The police, forensics, and goodness knows who else had been over the area with a fine-tooth comb on the evening of the murder and the morning after. Nevertheless, the walk would do her good and she might even go inside the house if the police had allowed it to reopen. Alan's morning hadn't gone well. The blood found on the pavement was not that of Mary Swinburne. So we are back to square one. Alan thumped his fist on his desk. So what the hell was David Drummond doing skirting around Granger Street the other evening? And if it wasn't Mary Swinburne's blood, whose was it? Sir, do you think we need to start this investigation from the beginning? Sergeant Andrews spoke quietly. The sergeant was aware that going back and starting from the beginning of a case was something DCI Johnson hated. He was a man who liked to get things right from the outset. Yet that wasn't always possible. There were times when the clues all led to a dead end and there was nothing else for it but to begin again. It was annoying, but it was something that went with the job. And where would that be? Alan retorted. Do we go back to the thefts as the chief constable would have us do? Or do we start with the murder of Mary Swinburne? Or even begin by investigating the cagey David Drummond? Alan shook his head. He hadn't meant to jump down his sergeant's throat. It wasn't his fault the investigation was falling apart. Yet at the moment, Alan knew his concentration wasn't entirely on the case. For one thing, he couldn't get Agnes out of his mind. He wasn't looking forward to the day she would return to her life in Essex. But, at the same time, he was very concerned for her safety. Already, Mary Swinburne, who had been a guest at the hotel, was lying dead in the mortuary at this very moment and no one knew why. Was it possible she had seen or overheard something incriminating and was murdered to keep her from passing on information to the police? If that was the case, then Agnes could be next. She was poking around everywhere, trying to find more and more evidence. Even now, she could be out there keeping watch on David Drummond. That last thought filled Alan with utmost horror. He had to get to the hotel too. Make sure she was all right. Get onto the pathologist and ask him to take another look at the body. There might be something he's missed. Alan barked out instructions as he reached for his coat. After that, start trying to find out a little more about David Drummond. For goodness sake, someone must know who the hell he is. Okay, sir. Andrews reached for his phone. Where will you be? I'm going back to the hotel to do a little more probing around. I suddenly get the feeling that there is more going on there than jewel thefts. Such as? Andrews asked. I don't know, the DCI replied, impatiently. It was true, he didn't know. But thinking about Mary Swinburne, the thefts, and now the possibility of another murder in the city center all being linked, made him wonder why Drummond hadn't simply disappeared when he believed Agnes was watching him. There had to be something else, some greater reason, for him to hang around the hotel. But at the moment, his main concern was for Agnes. Keep me informed with anything you find. And check the hospitals again. We need to be absolutely sure someone wasn't picked up on Granger Street and dumped outside an accident and emergency department in the city. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Agnes was enjoying her walk along the quayside. She was going to miss this. When she went back to Essex, she lived in a quiet village, and though it was very pleasant, she missed having more people around her. True, she had lots of friends in the village, but being here was different. Even though she didn't know the people she passed on the street, they all nodded and smiled as though she met up with them every morning. This was one part of Tyneside she remembered. Well, the friendliness of the people. It wasn't long before she found herself opposite Bessie Surtees's house. She looked up at the window she had seen being pulled shut that fateful night. There was someone gazing out of the window. Obviously, the house was open to visitors again. She crossed the road and stood on the very spot where she and Alan had found the body. There was nothing to see. It was as though she had dreamed the whole thing. She wasn't sure what she had expected to find. Alan had told her that no blood had been found either on the pavement or in the house itself, nor had the police discovered who had been in the house at the time they found the body. Why had Mary Swinburne been murdered? What had the poor woman done to upset someone enough for them to kill her? Why had her body been dumped here? Agnes looked towards the River Tyne. Could they have meant to throw the body into the river? If so, why had they found it necessary to stop and dump it on the pavement? And did David Drummond have anything to do with any of this? All these questions and more ran through her mind as she stood there gazing down at the ground. You all right, pet? Agnes looked up to see an elderly woman staring at her. Yes, thank you. It's just you looked a little lost standing there. I thought you might not be feeling well. I'm fine, thank you. Agnes smiled at the woman. The woman nodded and was about to turn away when Agnes quickly caught her arm. It's just that a friend and I found a body here a few nights ago, and I understand the police still don't know why the poor woman was killed. Agnes let go of the woman's arm. She was surprised at herself. Why on earth had she said that? Yes, that was a shame. Poor woman, I read about it in the papers. Nasty. Shock for you and your friend, though, coming across a body like that. Yes it was. Agnes nodded. There are some terrible people in the world. I'm sorry to have troubled you. Thank you for your concern. The woman started to walk off, but then changed her mind and turned back to face Agnes. I did see her one day. The woman nodded down towards the pavement. I'll be in touch, Alan said when the lift stopped at the reception area. Without another word, he strode off towards the entrance. Outside the hotel, Alan jumped into his car and drove along the quay. He wondered where Agnes might have decided to go today. He knew there were lots of places she wanted to visit, but since this case, she had put all that on hold. He wondered whether she had decided to go back to the Bessie Surtees Museum, though what she could hope to gain from going there escaped him. The whole area had been checked out by forensics the night he and Agnes found the body. He and other detectives had gone back the following morning to check it out in daylight, yet there had been no evidence of any shots being fired at that spot. But now, wise to the fact that Agnes was not the kind of person to be put off easily, he realized she could have decided to go back to take another look for herself. Traffic was busy on the quayside. The law courts had been sitting that morning. Perhaps there had been more cases than usual. There were certainly a great number of people milling around outside the building. Nevertheless, it wasn't long before he approached the museum. At first, he couldn't see Agnes, but then quite suddenly she appeared from the museum. Unfortunately, the traffic lights were against him, and he had to wait before he could move forward. He was still watching her when he saw her hail a passing taxi. At first, he thought of turning on the flashing blue lights and siren, but decided against it. It wasn't really appropriate. The lights changed and the traffic began to flow, but by now Agnes was inside the cab, probably giving the driver instructions as to where she wanted to go. He headed towards her, flashing his headlights, hoping she would see him and get out of the taxi. However, it didn't work. The taxi suddenly took off and turned at the corner of the road. It appeared to be heading towards the swing bridge. Damn. Alan slammed his hand against the steering wheel. There was nothing he could do. He was facing the wrong way. By the time he found somewhere safe to turn around, the taxi would be long gone. The sound of car horns blasting all around told him he needed to move on. So much for that, he thought, as he set off up the side towards the city center. But at least he felt a little relieved at having seen her. She was safe for the time being, anyway. Back at the police station, Alan found his sergeant was no further forward. It seemed that no unnamed person had been left at any of the hospitals in the city. At the moment, forensics is still trying to match the blood from the scene in Granger Street to anyone on their database, Andrews said. But so far they haven't come up with anything. He looked up from his notepad. Did you learn anything new at the hotel? If you call finding another theft anything new, then yes, I did. Alan slumped into his chair. Not another one. Yes, another one, Alan spoke slowly. He was mulling over the conversation he'd had with the Andersons. The chief constable is going to go ballistic over this, Andrews replied. This one is a little different. I'm not convinced the necklace belonged to Mrs. Anderson in the first place. Andrews looked up sharply. So you're saying that the necklace stolen from, what's her name? Mrs. Anderson. Alan interrupted. Mrs. Anderson, the sergeant repeated, was one you think they might have stolen from someone else. That about sums it up, Alan nodded. And that, Andrews, puts a whole new slant on the case. I see. Andrews thought about it for a moment. No, I'm sorry, I don't see. How does this alter the case of the missing jewelry? Think about it for a minute, said Alan, taking a deep breath. If he couldn't even sell this to his sergeant, what chance did he have with his superintendent? Suppose this particular piece of jewelry is what the thief had been looking for all the time? What if someone was being paid to steal a valuable necklace, only to have it stolen from them before they could deliver the goods and collect the money? He smiled to himself. Now he was beginning to sound like Agnes. With all these what-ifs, it's possible, Andrews replied slowly. But what happened to make you think the Andersons might have stolen this necklace? Alan pulled the photograph from his pocket. When I asked what the necklace looked like, Mr. Anderson handed me this correction. This is what he showed me. He was adamant I should hand it back. Alan passed the picture to Andrews, but I was just as adamant that I was going to keep it. Andrews peered closely at the photo before pulling a magnifying glass from his desk drawer to take a closer look. Strange. This picture seems to have been taken while the necklace was on display somewhere. He pointed to something in the photo and handed the magnifying glass to Alan. Look there, beyond the necklace. Could that be another display case in a jeweler's shop? That's exactly what I thought. Alan replied. It was the reason I was so determined not to hand back the photo. He paused. So now I am wondering whether we should be thinking more on the lines of a display of fine jewelry being shown at an exhibition somewhere. He fell silent, giving his sergeant time for the penny to drop. There's a rather expensive necklace being included in a show in Central London later this month. Andrews said slowly. He was still staring at the photograph. My wife is trying to get tickets. He looked up sharply, suddenly, realizing what his boss was getting at. Good heavens, you don't think the star attraction has been stolen, do you? Surely we would have heard about it. It would have been all over the news if something like that had happened. He looked at the picture again. Do you really think this is the piece in question? How could anyone have penetrated the high-level security? I don't know, Alan shrugged. However, if someone did manage to steal it before it even went on show, there must be a great number of red faces in London right now. The top brass looking after the jewelry would not want its disappearance broadcast across the world. It would be most embarrassing to explain the theft to the owner. My guess is they are hoping to get it back before the exhibition opens and the owner finds out it is missing. He sniffed. But it's all speculation. We don't know anything for certain. Nevertheless, such a necklace would be worth killing for if someone got wind it was at the Millennium Hotel here in Newcastle. Andrews said, excitedly. We could go on the assumption that the murder of Mary Swinburne is linked to the thefts at the hotel. Then there is the blood we found on Granger Street. He slumped back into his chair at a sudden thought. Though, we haven't yet found a match for that. Alan nodded. Not yet, but... Asterisk. Agnes enjoyed the tour across the Swing Bridge and then the Tyne Bridge. She had told the driver to go as slow as possible, but with traffic piling up behind, he was unable to travel too slowly. Hopefully, the next time they drove across both bridges, there wouldn't be quite so many cars. As they approached the Swing Bridge for the second time, Agnes sat up in her seat and peered from the taxi window. She didn't want to miss a thing. They were almost halfway across the bridge when she noticed something in the water. It seemed to be wrapped around one of the bridge supports. She could have sworn it wasn't there the first time they crossed. For a second it seemed to disappear beneath the water, but then resurfaced long enough for her to make out the shape of a body,